office had set up its answering machine to receive calls over the weekend. And included with the message that you would receive when you dial up this particular number, you would be instructed to leave your name and your address and to spell any difficult words. Monday morning when the secretaries came in and checked the answering machine for messages, one of the messages that was on the machine, a young lady in a very enthusiastic voice, gave her name and her address, and then she concluded the message with this sentence. My difficult word is reconciliation. R-E-C-O-N. She spelled it out. I thought of that when I was handed a piece of paper and asked to present a lesson along the line of, does God have a plan for our life, our job, our spouse, our home? And how can we pray for His intervention in these life choices? I'm almost tempted to fill out my own pieces of paper and stick something in that box that's easy. But since we've started doing that, we've been able to present lessons on the unpardonable sin and modern Israel and how does grace work. And some of these lessons I may not have thought to have studied on them if it hadn't been for you. And so I appreciate the cooperation and the enthusiasm that you all have had in sharing ideas for lessons to be presented. Does God have a plan for our life? When I think about this, it's really I feel like a dangerous topic because it's so easy to meander into opinions and suppositions along this line of thinking. There's really not one specific text that I can think of that would adequately address the question that was posed that we want to discuss this morning. And I have no illusions in the things that we talk about this morning that this is a thorough and complete treatment of the subject. But I'd like to begin at least to lay a groundwork, and if other questions arise, then we can build and go deeper into this subject as you have a desire. I broke this question into two sections. And the first question then that I'd like to address is, does God have a plan for your life? When you look at the scriptures, both the Old and the New, there are certain things that stand out when it comes to God's expectation of what it means to follow Him, to live a life that's pleasing in His sight. And I realize that there are certain things that God requires of us. In Micah chapter 6 and in verse 8, the prophet said, He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. So yes, there are things that God requires of us. He cares how we live on a day-to-day basis. There are also things that God wants to receive or wants for us. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, for this is good and acceptable in the sight of God. In the sight of God, our Savior, who desires all men to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. And there are things that we can see that God longs to receive from us. I think of the greatest commandment in Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 to 37. We should love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind. But Jesus went on and said there is a second commandment that's like unto it, to love your neighbor as yourself. And so when I think about my life, and I ask myself the question, does God have a plan for my life? And I have to answer that, yes, He does. He wants me to live a life that brings Him honor through my obedience. He wants me to come to Jesus and to find salvation. He wants that for everyone. He wants me to love Him with all of my being. And He wants that love that I have for God to overflow from my heart and my life to impact those that are around me. Love one another as we love ourselves. Yes, God does have a plan for your life. But then there's a second question that I think we need to ask. Has God planned your life? There are three examples that I would like for you to think about this morning when we think about this question. Has God planned your life? The first one is Joseph. And when you think about the providential intervention of God into an individual's life, one of the first people I think about is Joseph. In Genesis chapter 37, he had those dreams. Dreams of his siblings and his parents bowing down before him. In the middle part of that chapter, he was sent on a mission by his father to find where his brothers were keeping the sheep. And as he approached, Joseph had no way of knowing that his life was about to take a dramatic turn, leading to eventually him being sold into slavery. And then you think about his life as it's traced in those closing chapters of Genesis. How God blessed him even as a slave and elevated him. But soon he was faced with false accusations and he was falsely imprisoned for a long period of time. And then he had this opportunity for escape with the baker and the butler. And he interpreted their dreams in the prison. But even though he did this accurately, when the cupbearer was restored to his position, he forgot about Joseph. For 2 whole years, he continued there in that prison. But soon he was elevated to second in command of all of Egypt. And then eventually his brothers came down seeking food, and you remember the interaction that he had with them. But eventually he made himself known to his brothers, and he had his whole family brought down to Egypt. And Jacob lived in Egypt for the last 17 years of his life. And then Jacob died. And then the brothers began to worry. Now that the father's gone, Joseph can exact his revenge upon us for what we did to him. And so they go to Joseph and they plead with him to show mercy to him. In Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20, Moses records Joseph's reply. He said, "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about, as it is this day, to save many people alive." Joseph looked at the events that were happening to him. And it is interesting to me that it is only in retrospect that we see Joseph recognizing the hand of God in his life. we see a tremendous amount of faith in Joseph as he lived his life. Well, let's go back. Let's go back and talk about the event that landed him in prison when he was falsely accused by his master's wife. But when she made advances and tried to entice Joseph to become involved with her in an illicit way, Joseph responded to that in chapter 39 and verse 9 by saying, "How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" This was a young man who had his eyes clearly focused on the Lord of his life. And so as he was involved in this situation in which he was greatly tempted, we see this man's faith. But we don't see Joseph looking at the things that are happening to him and saying, "Oh, this is something that God is bringing into my life." He faces various difficult challenges and trials. He's put in prison, falsely held. And then he sees the opportunity for him to be set free, but then he's forgotten. And so Joseph endures these 2 years. He never lost his faith in God, but he didn't know what was going to happen next. I think about that popular poem a few years ago about the footprints in the sand. You remember that story as the person looked back and they only saw one set of footprints, and then they were told, "Well, those were the difficult times, and those were the times I was carrying you." That's what I think of when I think of the providence of God as it was working in Joseph's life. Joseph didn't look into his future and try to divine what God was going to bring into his life and how God was going to use these difficult situations. What Joseph did was he looked backwards in retrospect. And he glorified God for what he did through those difficult times. The providence of God is really only clearly realized when we reflect backwards and we realize God hasn't kept us from temptation. God hasn't built a wall around us so that we're not tempted or we don't have difficult situations in life. But look back over the hardships that you have navigated the difficult courses through. And you'll see, I think, the hand of God in your life. The second example is the example of Esther. And hopefully you're familiar with the story of Esther, but she was raised by her uncle and had the opportunity, or the requirement, I guess, to be included in the king's harem as he was searching for a wife. Esther was forbidden by her uncle Mordecai to identify herself as a Jew. So no one around her knew that she was of Jewish descent. But then comes this enemy of God, Haman, and he has it in for Mordecai. And so he decides that he has this plot all planned out where he's going to kill all of the Jews. And so Esther and Mordecai have this communication back and forth where he's urging her to go to the king. One of the rules, though, that the Persians and the Medes have was that no one could approach the king without being invited by the king. And the penalty of doing that is death unless the king held out his scepter to you, showing that he accepted you. So Mordecai communicates with Esther. And so let's go to Esther chapter 4, verses 13 and 14, because these are the verses that really, I think, help us to see the providential working of God. In Esther chapter 4, verses 13 and 14, Mordecai told them to answer Esther, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? It's a beautiful expression of Mordecai's belief and conviction in the providential working of God. There's something that we need to realize that is the backdrop of all of this. Haman's plan was the extermination of all the Jewish race. Have you ever thought about the implication the book of Esther has on the coming of Jesus Christ in the manger? If Haman would have been successful, the entire messianic line would have been wiped out. With that in mind, listen to what Mordecai says to Esther. You have to do this. And don't think that keeping yourself, your heritage secret will save you. If you don't do something, if you don't go to the king, then you and your father's house will be destroyed. But here's the important thing. He says, if you keep quiet, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. What is Mordecai telling Esther? He's telling her, this is your chance to save the Jewish people. But if you do not allow God to work through you, then God will work around you. What's the implication that I think is important, germane to our topic this morning? And that is the providential working of God is subjected to our individual free will. Esther had a choice. She could step up and save God's people, or she can remain silent and God would find another way to save the Jewish people. But then he tells her at the end, yet who knows whether you came to the kingdom for such a time as this? The story of Esther, I think, reaffirms what we saw in Joseph. Esther, looking to the future, she just saw danger. But when she looked back at the end of Esther, she could see God's providential leading. But it's subjected to our individual free will. We make a choice. No, actually, we make choices every day. Will I obey God in this situation? I know what's right. Will I do it? We make those choices every day. Perhaps we don't even think about them. But we're making choices about our future, our relationship with God. It's not something that God has written the script for, and all we need to do is carry it out, but we choose every day, over and over again. Will I obey God in this situation? Will I do what I know is right? The providence of God is best seen looking backwards. But we have a choice whether or not we will obey. And the third example is the example of Job. Job's life started out great. In chapter 1 and verse 1, Job is praised for his religious connection with God. He's a pious man. Job's a great man. But you know, as you start reading in that first chapter, it goes downhill pretty quickly. He loses this, he loses that, he loses his family, he loses his farms, he loses everything. And then Job's friends come. It just gets worse. And they're saying, you must have done something bad for God to treat you this way. Walk through the life of Job in your mind. We know the story. We're familiar with what happened to Job. But here's the thing that I think Job teaches us. And that is, there are things in life that we encounter over which we have absolutely no control. Job never knew. As far as the book of Job goes, Job is never told about Satan going to God and God saying, have you considered my servant Job? And Satan says, yeah, he serves you because you bless him. Take away those blessings and he will no longer serve you. Job was never told that. Job was never told that Satan came back a second time. And God said, have you considered my servant Job? And Job says, well, yes, he serves you because you bless his health. Let me take away his health and see if he serves you then. Job never knew that exchange took place. But he did know that his wife came to him and says, why do you hold on to your integrity? Curse God and die. And then his friends came and they started telling him, you must be a terrible sinner because God wouldn't punish you if you weren't this terrible person. And they started inventing things that Job must have done. In Job 19 and verse 16, his servants treat him rudely. In Job 19 and verse 18, young children mock him to his face. Job held on to his integrity. And then we come to that last chapter in the book of Job, where Job is blessed. And he receives twice as much as what he lost. And God recognizes Job. But through all the travails and all the troubles that came to Job, he had control over absolutely none of it. Well, there's one thing he did have control of. His reaction. And he never let go of that control. He stubbornly maintained that he would ultimately be vindicated by God. When we think about the providential working of God, we realize that there are things that happen to us in our lives. That happen. We make bad choices. Someone else makes a bad choice, and we pay the consequences of it. We get sick. We find trials and temptations. We suffer and we die. But we can see in our lives, we can see in our choices, the hand of God. Has God planned your life? No. We live our lives based on our choices. So the second question that I think we need to ask, or the statement that we need to consider, is how do I make God's plan my plan? And this is important, I think, for us to consider. Too many times, this statement, or actually this question, is asked inappropriately. Too many times we flip it around and we want to know, how do I make my plan God's plan? We're going in the wrong direction there. Because what we need to be able to fully appreciate and experience God's providential care for us as individuals is we need to accept God's plan for our life and not try to make our plan God's plan. And so we come to James chapter 4. In verses 13 through 17, James relates this parable, if you will, of a businessman who plans out this huge business venture that he's going to engage upon. He has everything covered in this plan, where he's going, how long he's staying, what he's going to do there, even the outcome. I'm going to get rich. James says there's one thing that he forgot. He forgot to seek out God's will. So let's walk through the 4th chapter of James. How do I make God's plan my plan? And here are 6 steps that James, I think, leads us to, culminating in verses 13 through 17. The first thing I need to do is to seek God's will. In James chapter 4, verse 2, the latter part of the verse where we'll begin, James says, "You fight and war, yet you do not have, because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive, because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures." The people to whom the book of James was written, were trying to live the Christian life in a world of wickedness. And the wickedness in the world had spilled over into the church. And so James is telling them, to get back on the right track, you need to seek God's will. You're praying for it, but no, you're not. You're praying for your will to be done, not God's. And so you pray and you ask and you do not receive. And the reason you don't receive is because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your own pleasures. You're not seeking God. Put God first. Seek God in your life. And then you need to submit to God's leadership. James chapter 4, verse 7. Therefore, submit to God. Place yourself in submission to God, recognizing that God is the leader. God leads us in the way. His word is described as a lamp that lights our path that we can follow. But we have to submit to God's leadership in order for that to take place. And then we have to strive to live in God's constant presence. We cheat ourselves if we think that when we assemble together, as we have this morning, that we are coming into God's presence. And then when we dismiss in a few minutes and we go out into the world, are we leaving God's presence behind? God is with us always. And for me to be able to fully experience and appreciate God's providential care for me, I have to recognize His constant presence in my life. And I need to strive in my life to live aware of God's presence. And then James tells us I need to strip away sin from my heart. Go back to chapter 4, verse 8. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. We need to strip away our sin that separates us from God. And then we need to surrender to God's direction. Verse 10. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He will lift you up. And then we need to seize the opportunities of life to the glory of God. If this businessman in verses 13 through 17 had approached his business venture having taken these steps, then he would have included God in his plans. How do I serve God every day? But he excluded God. And so James says, what is your life? It's but a vapor that appears for a little time and then it vanishes away. You don't know what will happen tomorrow. And then he says, instead you ought to say, in verse 15, if the Lord wills, we shall do this or that. That kind of obedience, that kind of submission embraces the providence of God. And when we look back over a life that was lived by these choices, we can see what God has done for us, how he has helped us through the difficult times of life, how he has helped us to endure life's difficulties. An unknown author has written, it takes a lot of courage to put things in God's hands, to give ourselves completely, our lives, our hopes, our plans, to follow where he leads us and make his will our own. But all it takes is foolishness to go the way alone. Life is filled with difficulties. But here's the beautiful lesson. We're not alone. Our Lord has said, I'll be with you always, even to the end of the world. He's always with us. He's near to us. And we'll make choices in life. We have to choose between right and wrong. Sometimes we have to choose between good and better. But if we strive to make God's will ours, then we can look back on our life and see his loving care for us and all the blessings that he brings to our lives. So this morning, I would like to close with one final question. Are you the person this morning that God, through his providence, wants you to be? And we go back to where we began. What does he require of you? What does he want from you? What does he long to see in you? This morning, if you're outside of Christ, he wants you to be in him. And we get in him through baptism. And if as a child of God, you have been living your life on your own terms, he wants you to come and to submit to him. That he can go with you through life's difficulties. And you can bring him glory in the way that you live. So if you're subject to the Lord's invitation this morning, we want to invite you to come and to kneel at the cross, because that's where your journey needs to begin. Please come as we stand and sing.